"Sir, you need to leave the stage now." The man did not respond. He only held the violin more firmly. "This is not in the program," someone insisted from backstage. "The audience is already waiting." Some people in the audience began to applaud, thinking it was part of the show. Others looked confused. "Please," the voice became harder, "get off the stage." The man took a step back, not toward the exit, but toward the center. The orchestra hesitated. The light remained on. And before security could act, he raised the bow. The crowd still did not know who he was, but in a few seconds, they would understand that they had just told the wrong person to leave the stage. The stage was a space of absolute precision. Every entrance had been rehearsed, every movement timed, every person there had a clear function. At events of that magnitude, nothing happened by chance, and when it did, it was corrected quickly. To the audience, everything seemed normal. Lights on, instruments tuned, the typical expectation before a great moment. Many believed that man on stage was part of some planned surprise, a different introduction, perhaps even a staged error. The organization knew it was not. He was not on the list. He had not been announced. There was no authorization for him to be there. That was why the order came without hesitation. It was not personal, it was procedure. Those who work backstage learn early that the stage is no place for human improvisations. Faux delay, a wrong entrance, an unplanned presence can compromise everything: the show, the broadcast, the security. The man, however, did not act like someone lost. He did not seem nervous. He was not looking for help. He showed no urgency to justify himself. This was unsettling. Normally, those who make mistakes try to explain. Those who intrude try to defend themselves. He did neither. He just remained there, with the violin in his hands, as if that were exactly the place he should be. Some musicians exchanged quick glances. The orchestra felt the tension even before understanding it. When someone on stage does not follow the script, discomfort spreads silently. In the audience, confusion grew. Timid applause emerged and died quickly. People looked around trying to decipher whether this was part of the show or if they were witnessing a real error. And that was the problem. If it was an error, it needed to end. If it was part of the show, it needed to begin. But the man gave no clue. While the organization prepared to intervene again, no one there imagined that this moment, apparently technical, bureaucratic, small, was about to transform into something impossible to control. Because some presences do not need to be announced. They just need a few seconds to be recognized. And those seconds were about to begin. The communication came again, now more direct. There was no irritation in the voice, just the firmness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sir, we need to clear the stage immediately." The man turned his face just enough to indicate he had heard. He did not respond. He did not argue. This silence was interpreted as resistance. Backstage, someone made a discreet signal. Security approached a few steps, without haste, but with clarity of intention. This needed to end before the audience realized something was truly wrong. For the organization, there was no moral dilemma. There was a schedule. The stage needed to be returned to control. In the audience, doubt spread. Some people laughed nervously. Others whispered, trying to understand if this was part of the show. A real error in such a rehearsed environment seemed too unlikely to be accepted immediately. The man then took a small step forward, not in defiance, not in provocation. It was a natural movement, like someone positioning themselves before starting something, not before leaving. The orchestra remained motionless. No one dared to play. The tension was now visible, not dramatic, but dense. That kind of collective discomfort that arises when no one knows anymore which rule is in effect. Security hesitated for a second, not because the protocol was confusing, but because that man's behavior did not match the error he supposedly had committed. Those who intrude usually look around. Those who make mistakes usually apologize. He did neither. He held the violin with too much familiarity, as if the stage were not a forbidden space, but a known place. And at that instant, even without knowing why, some people in the audience began to feel that sending that man away might not just be a technical correction. Perhaps it was a mistake. The coordinator in charge moved closer to the wing, speaking into his headset with controlled urgency. "We have a situation on stage. Unidentified individual. Need immediate removal." But his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. Something about the man's posture, about the way he stood there with such complete calm, created doubt where there should have been none. In the third row, an elderly woman leaned toward her husband. "Does he look lost to you?" she whispered. The husband shook his head slowly. "No, he does not look lost at all." That observation was spreading through the audience without words, a collective sensing that something was off about the official narrative being presented to them. The man did not behave like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. He behaved like someone who knew exactly where he was. The lighting technician adjusted the spots, trying to create a subtle pressure, making the stage less comfortable for the intruder. But the man did not squint, did not shield his eyes. He simply stood there, the violin held with the kind of ease that comes only from decades of practice. One of the violinists in the orchestra, a woman who had played professionally for 20 years, noticed his grip on the instrument. She nudged the cellist beside her. "Look at his left hand," she whispered. "That is not an amateur." The cellist observed for a moment, then his eyes widened slightly. He leaned toward the conductor's podium, trying to catch the attention of their musical director, but the director was already engaged in an intense conversation via his own headset, clearly receiving instructions from management. Security advanced another step. Two men now approaching from different sides, their movements professional, but not aggressive. They had been trained for disruptions, but this was unlike anything in their manual. The usual signs were absent. No intoxication, no erratic behavior, no apparent mental distress, just a man standing calmly with a violin. The audience's confusion was transforming into something else: curiosity, investment. They had come for a performance, and now they were getting something unscripted, something real. Phones began emerging from pockets and purses, not obviously, but present nonetheless, ready to capture whatever happened next. "Sir," one of the security guards said, his voice low but firm, "we are going to have to escort you off the stage now. Please come with us." The man finally turned his head, looking directly at the guard. His expression was not defiant. It was not pleading. It was simply present. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that he understood what was being asked of him, but he did not move toward the exit. Instead, he adjusted his stance slightly, distributing his weight more evenly. A subtle shift that any musician would recognize as preparation. The preparation that comes before performance, not before departure. The second guard moved closer, reaching out, not grabbing but preparing to guide him away with a hand on the elbow. Protocol dictated gentle but firm removal. No force unless absolutely necessary. No scene that could turn into a public relations disaster. The man looked down at the violin in his hands. He ran one finger along the curve of its body, a gesture so tender and familiar that several people in the front rows felt something catch in their throats. There was a relationship there, between man and instrument, that transcended the current circumstances. The orchestra members were now fully attentive, instruments forgotten in laps, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Some of them had begun to suspect, but suspicion without confirmation is just a whisper of possibility. The stage manager appeared in the wing, his face tight with stress. This was his responsibility, his show, his reputation on the line if this escalated. He made a cutting gesture with his hand, universal language for "end this now." But the man had already made his decision. He lifted the violin to his shoulder, not quickly, not dramatically, with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had done this action 10,000 times before, perhaps 100,000 times. The kind of muscle memory that bypasses thought entirely. The bow, which had been held loosely in his right hand, came up to meet the strings. The first guard reached out. "Sir, please do not." But it was already too late. The bow touched the strings, and the first note emerged into the silence of the concert hall. Clear, pure, unmistakable, and in that single note, everything changed. Not because it was loud, not because it was showy, but because it was perfect. The kind of perfection that comes not from technique alone, but from something deeper, from understanding, from decades of dialogue between musician and instrument, from a relationship with music that most people only dream of achieving. The guard's hand stopped in mid-air. He did not complete the motion to remove the man. He could not. Something about that sound made interference feel like sacrilege. In the audience, someone gasped, then someone else. Recognition beginning to dawn, not in their minds yet, but in their bodies, in that primal place where humans respond to beauty before they can name it. The second note came, then the third. A melody was forming, nothing ostentatious, nothing designed to show off, just simple, exquisite phrasing that filled the space with undeniable authority. The orchestra members sat up straighter, The woman violinist who had noticed his grip now covered her mouth with her hand. The cellist closed his eyes, listening with his entire being. And somewhere in the fifth row, a man who had attended hundreds of concerts in his lifetime leaned forward and whispered to no one in particular, "Oh my God," because he knew. His ears knew before his mind could process it. His heart knew before his brain could name it. And in seconds, everyone else would know too. The stage manager in the wing lowered his hand, the cutting gesture abandoned. He stood frozen, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and then something close to horror. The coordinator with the headset went pale. He pulled the device away from his ear as if it had burned him, and the two security guards, trained professionals who prided themselves on handling any situation, simply stood there, paralyzed by the realization of what they had almost done, what they had been seconds away from doing. The man continued to play, his eyes closed now, giving himself fully to the music, giving the audience what he had come to give them, what he had always given them, what he would continue to give them for as long as he was able. And the question hanging in the air, unspoken but pressing, was not whether they would let him continue. It was how they would ever forgive themselves for trying to stop him. The melody continued to unfold, each note placed with such precision that it seemed to create its own space in the air. The man played with his eyes still closed, completely absorbed in the music, as if the audience, the security, the entire situation had dissolved into irrelevance. The two guards stood motionless, neither advancing nor retreating. They had become statues of their own uncertainty. Training told them to complete the task. Instinct told them they had already made a terrible mistake. In the wings, frantic whispered conversations erupted among the production staff. The stage manager had his hand over his headset, listening to someone shouting instructions that no longer made any sense. His face had gone from pale to flushed, his free hand gripping the edge of the equipment case so tightly his knuckles were white. "Someone get the program," he hissed to an assistant. "Check the name. Check everything." But he already knew. They all knew. You do not work in this industry for 20 years without being able to recognize certain truths when they announce themselves. The orchestra members had abandoned all pretense of neutrality. Several were leaning forward in their chairs, some with tears in their eyes. The first violinist, the woman who had noticed his grip, had both hands pressed to her chest. Her colleague beside her had simply given up and was crying openly. In the audience, the recognition was spreading like dawn, slow at first, then suddenly illuminating everything. People sat up straighter. Phones that had been out were now lowered, forgotten. This was not something to be recorded. This was something to be experienced. A woman in the seventh row grabbed her husband's arm with both hands. "That is him," she whispered urgently. "That is actually him." Her husband nodded, unable to speak, his throat too tight with emotion. 3 rows behind them, a teenage girl who had been dragged to the concert against her will by her parents, now sat transfixed, her usual bored expression replaced by wonder. She had never understood what her parents tried to tell her about live music. She understood now. The man on stage transitioned into a new phrase, the melody shifting from simplicity to something more complex, more layered. His bow moved with fluid grace, drawing sounds from the violin that seemed impossible, that seemed to come not from wood and strings, but from somewhere deeper, from the instrument's soul, if such things could be said to exist. And if anyone in that hall had doubted before, they doubted no longer. This was not competence. This was not even excellence. This was mastery. This was art. This was the thing that happens when technique becomes so ingrained that it transcends itself and becomes pure expression. The security guard closest to the man slowly lowered his outstretched hand. He took a step backward, then another. His face showed not embarrassment, but something more profound, a kind of awe mixed with relief that he had not actually touched the man, had not actually interrupted this. His colleague did the same, both of them retreating to the edge of the stage, trying to become invisible, to erase their presence from this moment that they had nearly destroyed. Backstage, the coordinator who had given the initial order to remove the intruder sat down heavily on the equipment crate. He pulled off his headset and held it in his lap, staring at nothing. Around him, staff members who had been frantically trying to manage the crisis now stood in small clusters, silent, listening. The music reached a crescendo, not through volume but through intensity. Every note mattered, every phrase built on the one before it. The man's face, still visible in the stage lights, showed complete peace. This was where he belonged. This was what he did. And for these few minutes, nothing else existed. In the front row, an elderly man who had been a classical musician himself for 40 years before arthritis ended his career, openly wept. His wife held his hand, understanding without words what this meant to him. To witness this level of artistry performed by this particular artist in these unlikely circumstances, it was almost more than the heart could bear. The piece moved toward a quieter section, the notes becoming gentler, more intimate. It was as if the man was now speaking directly to each person individually, sharing a secret, offering a gift that existed only in this moment and could never be perfectly replicated. A young man in the balcony, who had saved for months to afford a ticket, covered his face with his hands. He had hoped to see this musician perform tonight. He had prayed for it, and now, through the strangest possible circumstance, he was getting something even more precious. An unplanned, unrehearsed, utterly authentic moment of pure music. The orchestra's conductor, who had been standing in the wings during all of this, finally moved. He walked slowly onto the stage, not to stop what was happening but to bear witness to it. He stood at a respectful distance, his hands clasped in front of him, his head slightly bowed. A gesture of respect from one musician to another, from one artist to someone he clearly recognized as a peer, as a master. The man playing the violin opened his eyes briefly, saw the conductor, and gave the slightest nod, an acknowledgement, a thank you. Then his eyes closed again, and he continued. The melody began to wind toward a conclusion, not abruptly, not with fanfare, but with the same care and precision that had characterized every note that came before, each phrase carefully shaped, each tone given its full value, each silence between notes honored as part of the music. The audience held its collective breath. No one wanted this to end. No one wanted to return to the world where mistakes had been made and awkwardness would have to be addressed. They wanted to stay in this perfect bubble where only the music mattered, but all performances must end. And this one, unplanned as it was, would end too. The final note hung in the air, sustained with such control that it seemed to last forever. The vibrato was perfect, the tone unwavering, and when the bow finally lifted from the strings, when the sound finally faded into silence, no one moved. The silence itself seemed sacred, a necessary pause between the music and whatever would come next. Then from somewhere in the back of the hall, a single person began to clap, slowly, deliberately. Then another joined, and within seconds the entire audience was on its feet, applauding with such force that the sound filled the hall like thunder. Not polite applause, not appreciative applause, but the kind of ovation that comes from deep gratitude, from witnessing something rare, from being present for a moment that would live in memory long after the details faded. The man lowered the violin and the bow to his sides. He opened his eyes fully now and looked out at the audience. His expression was gentle, grateful, but also carried a hint of something else, perhaps understanding of what had just happened, of the error that had nearly been made, of the grace that had allowed this moment to unfold despite that error. The stage manager appeared at the edge of the stage, his face a mask of professional composure that did not quite hide his distress. He approached the man carefully, as one might approach something precious and fragile. He did not speak. Words seemed inadequate. Instead, he simply bowed, a deep, genuine bow of respect and apology. The man responded with a slight smile and a small nod. No anger, no accusation, just acceptance. The coordinator with the headset approached from the other side, his face showing clear remorse. "Sir, I must apologize," he began, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "We did not realize, we had no way of knowing." The man raised a hand, gentle, stopping the apology. "It is all right," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth as his playing. "These things happen, no harm was done." "But there was harm," the coordinator insisted. "We tried to remove you, we nearly stopped you from playing." The man's smile widened slightly. "Nearly," he agreed, "but you did not. The music happened. That is what matters." The applause continued, showing no signs of diminishing. People in the audience were calling out, though their words were lost in the general noise. Some were crying, some were laughing, all were clapping. The orchestra members had joined the standing ovation, something rarely done, a sign of immense respect from performers for another performer. And in the midst of all this celebration, all this recognition, all this belated acknowledgement, the man simply stood there, holding his violin, smiling gently, completely at peace. Because he had never needed their permission to belong on that stage. He had never needed their recognition to be who he was. The music itself had always been enough. But now, finally, everyone else understood that too. The question that remained was not about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. How would this evening proceed now? How would the organization recover from this error? And most importantly, what would this unexpected beginning mean for everything that was supposed to follow? The applause finally began to diminish, not because the audience's enthusiasm had waned, but because people needed to understand what would happen next. The energy in the hall had completely transformed. What had begun as an evening of anticipated excellence had become something else entirely. Something unplanned, something precious. The man remained on stage, still holding his violin, his expression serene and patient. He seemed in no hurry to explain himself, no hurry to claim credit or demand acknowledgement. He simply existed in the moment, comfortable with whatever would unfold. The stage manager approached more closely now, joined by another figure emerging from the wings, a woman in elegant attire who clearly held significant authority, the event director, most likely. Her face showed the careful neutrality of someone managing a situation that had spiraled far beyond her control. She approached the man and extended her hand. He took it, his handshake apparently warm and brief. She spoke to him, her words inaudible to the audience, but her body language suggested apology mixed with immense relief. The man responded with what appeared to be reassurance, his free hand making a dismissive gesture that seemed to say, "It was nothing, forget it, let us move forward." But the audience had not forgotten, could not forget, would never forget. A murmur was rising through the crowd now, not of confusion, but of excited realization. People were turning to their neighbors, confirming what they had suspected, sharing the extraordinary story of what they had just witnessed. The stranger who was not a stranger, the intruder who had every right to be there, the error that had transformed into something miraculous. In the wings, the original conductor of the evening's planned program stood with his score clutched to his chest, his face showing a complex mixture of emotions. He had prepared for weeks to lead this concert. He had rehearsed every transition, every tempo change, every dynamic shift. And now, without warning, the entire trajectory of the evening had been altered by an event no one could have predicted. But as he watched the man on stage, as he saw the audience's response, as he felt the electricity in the air, his expression softened, because he too was a musician. He understood what had just occurred. Magic had happened. Real, unscripted, impossible to manufacture magic. And any true artist would recognize that as something to be honored, not resented. The event director turned to address the audience, moving to center stage with a wireless microphone that someone had quickly provided. She waited for the murmur to quiet, her professional smile firmly in place, though her eyes betrayed her continued nervousness about how to handle this situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's excellent sound system. "I believe we owe someone an explanation, and perhaps more importantly, an apology." The audience quieted fully, everyone leaning forward slightly, eager to hear the official acknowledgement of what they had already understood. "Due to a miscommunication in our backstage coordination," she continued, carefully choosing her words, "we did not realize that one of tonight's most honored guests had arrived and made his way to the stage. What you witnessed just now was our mistake being corrected in the most beautiful way possible, through music." A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the crowd. The tension was breaking, the awkwardness being diffused by her graceful handling of an impossible situation. She turned to the man beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen, though I suspect many of you have already recognized him, it is my genuine honor to officially introduce to you Maestro André Rieu." The applause that erupted this time was even louder than before. Not just appreciation for the music now, but celebration of the man himself, recognition of his grace under pressure, acknowledgement of his dignity in the face of an error that would have embarrassed many others. André stepped forward, raising his hand to quiet the ovation, his smile warm and genuine. When the noise finally subsided enough for him to speak, he did not take the microphone. He simply spoke, his voice carrying naturally through the acoustics of the hall. "Thank you," he said simply. "I must confess this was not how I expected this evening to begin." Laughter rippled through the audience again, but affectionate laughter, the kind shared among people who have gone through something together. "When I arrived tonight," André continued, "I was running a bit late. I came through a different entrance than planned, and apparently, without my identification properly visible, I looked very much like someone who should not be on this stage." He paused, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. To be fair to the excellent security team here, I suppose I did not do much to explain myself either. I thought it might be simpler to simply show them rather than tell them. More laughter, but also a collective sigh of relief. He was not angry. He was not making anyone feel worse than they already felt. He was, instead, turning the error into a story that everyone could share. A story that would be told and retold, growing in warmth with each telling. But I must tell you, he continued, his tone becoming more serious, more heartfelt, what happened here in these last few minutes is something quite special. Not because of my playing, many of you have heard me play before, but because of what it revealed. He paused, looking out over the audience, his gaze seeming to touch each person individually. Music, he said softly, does not care about credentials. It does not care about programs or schedules or proper procedures. Music simply is, and when it speaks, when it is allowed to speak freely, it has the power to transcend any confusion, any mistake, any human error. The hall was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on his words. Tonight you gave me an incredible gift. You listened, not because my name was in a program, not because someone told you to listen, but because the music itself asked you to, and you answered. Several people in the audience were crying openly now, moved not just by his words, but by the genuine emotion behind them. André turned to the event director and the stage manager, who both looked like they wished the floor would open and swallow them. He reached out and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. These good people, he said, turning back to the audience, were simply doing their jobs, protecting the integrity of this performance, making sure everything proceeded as planned. There is no fault in that. In fact, we should appreciate their dedication. The event director's eyes filled with tears. The stage manager's throat worked visibly as he tried to maintain his composure. So let us begin again, André suggested, properly this time, with everyone in their right places, with the program as it was meant to unfold, and let us make this an evening that lives up to the remarkable beginning we have just shared. The applause this time was different again, deeper, more resonant. It was gratitude for his generosity, appreciation for his humanity, recognition that they were in the presence of someone who understood that being a great artist meant more than technical skill. It meant grace. It meant compassion. It meant lifting others up, rather than using one's position to diminish them. As André walked toward the wings, the planned conductor approached him. They embraced briefly, speaking words the audience could not hear, but the warmth of their interaction was visible to all. Two musicians, two artists, both understanding what this evening had become. The orchestra members took their positions, the anticipation now different than it had been at the start. They were no longer preparing to perform a routine concert. They were preparing to be part of something that had already transcended routine, that had already become memorable. But as the musicians settled, as the audience waited with renewed attention, as the technical staff made their final adjustments, a new question emerged, one that had not been fully resolved. Where exactly did André Rieu fit into tonight's program? Was he a guest, a special performer, a surprise addition? And if he was any of those things, why had no one backstage known he was coming? Why had his name not appeared on any of the lists? Why had the confusion occurred in the first place? The event director returned to the microphone, and something in her expression suggested that she too had been asking these same questions, and that the answers she had found were not entirely comfortable ones. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice still professional but now carrying an edge of something else. Concern, perhaps, or confusion. Before we continue with our scheduled program, I need to share something with you. Something we have just discovered backstage. The audience, which had been settling into their seats, preparing to enjoy the rest of the evening, went still again. André, standing in the wings now, turned back toward the stage, his eyebrows raised slightly in question. "When we checked our records just now," the director continued, "we found something unexpected. Maestro Rieu was indeed on tonight's guest list. His name appears clearly in our files. He was scheduled to make a brief appearance during the second half of the program." She paused, and in that pause, everyone in the hall felt the approaching revelation. But what we cannot understand, what we are still trying to determine, is why his name was removed from tonight's active roster. Someone, at some point this afternoon, deleted his entry from the current schedule, and we do not know who or why. A collective intake of breath rippled through the audience. This was no longer a simple story of miscommunication. This was something else, something potentially more troubling. André's expression had shifted from amusement to something more guarded. He exchanged a quick glance with the conductor, who looked equally bewildered. And in that moment, everyone realized that the evening's unexpected beginning might not have been accidental at all, that there might be more to this story than a simple backstage confusion, that someone for some reason had deliberately tried to keep André Rieu off that stage. The question now was not just what had happened, it was why, and who, and what else might unfold before this remarkable evening finally came to an end. The revelation hung in the air like a discordant note waiting to resolve. The audience shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to process this new information. What had been a heartwarming story of error and forgiveness had suddenly taken on a darker tone. André remained in the wings, his expression thoughtful but calm. If this revelation disturbed him, he showed no sign of it. Instead, he seemed to be thinking, processing, trying to understand the situation from all angles before reacting. The event director continued, her voice steady despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. "We are conducting a full investigation to understand exactly what happened, but I want to assure everyone, and especially Maestro Rieu, that this was clearly not an authorized action. His presence here tonight has always been welcomed, more than welcomed, eagerly anticipated." She turned to André, her expression genuinely distressed. "Maestro, I cannot apologize enough for this confusion. Whatever happened in our system, whoever made this change, it does not reflect how we feel about you or your artistry." André stepped forward slightly, just enough to be clearly visible to the audience while remaining in the wings. His hand gestured gently, a calming motion. "Please," he said, his voice carrying that same warm tone he had used earlier. "Let us not allow this to overshadow what should be a beautiful evening. Mistakes happen, systems fail, people make errors in judgment. What matters is how we respond to these things. But someone deliberately removed your name," a voice called out from the audience. "That is not just a mistake, that is sabotage." The word hung heavy in the air. Sabotage, such a loaded term, such ugly implications. André was quiet for a moment. Then he moved fully onto the stage again, his presence immediately commanding attention without demanding it. He did not take the microphone. He did not need it. "I have been performing for many, many years," he said, his tone conversational, intimate. "And in that time I have learned something important. There are always reasons why people do what they do. Sometimes those reasons come from fear, sometimes from misunderstanding, sometimes from pain we cannot see." He paused, looking out over the audience with genuine warmth. "Whatever happened tonight, whoever made the choice to remove my name from the schedule, I am certain there was a reason. Perhaps not a good reason, perhaps not a justified reason, but a human reason." The event director looked like she wanted to interrupt, to insist on accountability, but André's gentle hand motion stopped her. "Here is what I know to be true," André continued. "I was not announced. I was asked to leave. I chose instead to play. And because of that, we all experienced something remarkable, something unscripted, something that could never have happened if everything had gone according to plan." He smiled, and it was genuine, reaching his eyes. "So perhaps in a strange way, whoever removed my name did us all a favor. They gave us a story. They gave us a moment of genuine surprise. They reminded us all that music is more powerful than programs or schedules or official approvals." A murmur moved through the audience, people processing this unexpected perspective. It was not what they had anticipated. They had been ready for justified anger, for demands, for accountability, for drama. Instead, they were being offered grace, understanding, forgiveness for someone who did not even know they were being forgiven. But the audience was not the only group processing this information. Backstage, among the crew and staff, people were exchanging glances, having whispered conversations. Someone here knew what had happened. Someone had made that change to the schedule. And now, hearing André's generous response, that person was facing a choice. Come forward and admit to what they had done, risking consequences, or remain silent and carry the weight of that secret alone. The orchestra had taken their positions during this exchange, and now they waited, instruments ready, looking to their conductor for direction. The conductor looked to André. André looked to the event director. The event director took a breath, made a decision. "Let us proceed with the evening," she said firmly. "We will continue our investigation privately, but right now, we have an audience that came here for music, and that is what we should give them." André nodded his agreement, preparing to leave the stage again to let the scheduled program continue. But before he could take more than a few steps, a voice called out from backstage. "Wait, please wait." Everyone turned toward the wings. A young man emerged, perhaps in his mid-20s, wearing the black attire of stage crew. His face was pale, his hands visibly shaking. He looked terrified, but determined. "It was me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying in the sudden silence. "I removed the name from the schedule. It was me." The event director's expression hardened. "Why would you do such a thing?" The young man's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid." This answer was so unexpected that no one knew how to respond immediately. Afraid? Afraid of what? The young man took a shuddering breath. "My father," he began, then stopped, started again. "My father was a musician, a violinist. Not famous, not successful, but dedicated. He practiced for hours every day. He dreamed of playing in orchestras like this one. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. He applied everywhere, sent recordings, attended auditions, year after year after year, and every time he was rejected, told he was not good enough, told there was no place for him. The young man's voice broke, and eventually he stopped trying, stopped playing, put his violin away and never touched it again. He got a regular job, supported our family, pretended he was fine, but he was not fine. The music died in him, and I watched it happen." André had gone very still, his expression intent, listening with complete focus. And then the young man continued. "I started working here, in concert halls, around musicians, around music, and every time I saw Maestro Rieu's name on a schedule, every time I heard about him, I felt this anger, because here was someone who had achieved everything my father dreamed of, who made it look easy, who was celebrated everywhere while my father was forgotten." He looked directly at André now, tears streaming down his face. "I know it is not your fault. I know you did not do anything to my father. I know my anger is not rational. But when I saw your name on tonight's schedule, I could not stand the thought of watching another celebration of your success while remembering my father's failure. So I deleted your name. I told myself I was preventing a schedule conflict. But really, I just wanted you to feel even a fraction of what my father felt. Not belonging, not being wanted, being told to leave." The silence that followed this confession was profound. No one knew what to say, how to react. This was pain speaking. Deep, long-held pain that had found an outlet in a moment of poor judgment. André stood very still for several long moments. Then, slowly, he walked across the stage toward the young man. The audience held its collective breath, unsure what would happen next. When André reached him, he did not speak immediately. Instead, he set down his violin carefully on a nearby stand. Then he opened his arms, and he embraced the crying young man. The young man collapsed into the embrace, sobbing openly now, all his held pain and anger and confusion pouring out. André held him, one hand on his back, the other on his shoulder, simply present in that moment of crisis. "What was your father's name?" André asked gently. The young man could barely speak through his tears. "Villim. Villim Janssen." André nodded slowly. "And does your father still have his violin?" The young man pulled back slightly, confused by the question. "Yes. I think so. It is in storage somewhere." "Then here is what I would like to propose," André said, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "I would like to meet your father. I would like to hear his story. And if he is willing, I would like him to play for me." The young man stared at him, uncomprehending, but he stopped playing. He gave up. "Perhaps," André said gently, "he gave up performing. But I suspect he never truly gave up music. That is not something you can give up. It becomes part of who you are. And if he was as dedicated as you say, then he deserves to be heard. Maybe not on a grand stage, maybe not in a competition or audition, but heard nonetheless." He turned to address the audience. "There are so many musicians like Villim Janssen, talented, dedicated, passionate, but for whom circumstances never aligned in the right way. They do not stop being musicians just because they do not make it their career. They carry that music inside them forever." André looked back at the young man. "Your father's story is not a failure story. It is a love story. He loved music enough to dedicate years to it. That love is valuable, regardless of whether it led to a professional career." The young man was nodding now, still crying, but beginning to calm down. "I never thought of it that way. I would be honored to meet him," André repeated, "and I suspect your father has much he could teach me." Success can sometimes make us forget the pure love that brought us to music in the first place. People like your father, who continue to love music even when it does not bring them recognition or reward, they remember what is most important. The event director had been standing frozen during this entire exchange, clearly unsure whether she should be moved by this resolution or concerned about the breach of protocol that had started everything. She cleared her throat. Maestro Rieu, that is incredibly generous, but we still need to address the fact that your information was deliberately removed from our system. André turned to her with a gentle smile. I think we just did address it. A young man made a mistake born from pain. He has acknowledged that mistake. He has shown genuine remorse, and I have chosen to respond with understanding rather than punishment. Is that not sufficient? The young man looked up at André, his expression showing something like wonder. You are not angry with me. Oh, I am sure I will have a moment later tonight where I think about how differently this evening could have gone, André said with a slight laugh. But anger? No. How can I be angry at someone for loving their father enough to hurt on his behalf? The audience, which had been watching this entire exchange with rapt attention, began to applaud again. Not the thunderous ovation from before, but something more emotional, more personal. They were not applauding a performance now. They were applauding humanity, compassion, the choice to meet pain with understanding rather than retaliation. André turned to the event director. Now I believe we have kept these good people waiting long enough. Shall we finally give them the concert they came here for? The director nodded, visibly relieved that the crisis had resolved without further incident. She gestured to the orchestra, to the conductor indicating they should proceed. But as André turned to leave the stage, the young man called after him. Maestro Rieu, would you really like to meet my father? André stopped and looked back. Absolutely. Give your contact information to the event director. I will arrange something. The young man nodded, wiping his eyes again. Thank you. Thank you so much. André smiled. Thank your father for me too, for reminding us all that music matters. That it is worth dedicating yourself to, whether the world recognizes that dedication or not. And finally, with all the unexpected drama resolved, with grace extended and received, with painful truths acknowledged and forgiven, the actual scheduled concert could finally begin. But no one in that hall believed for a moment that anything planned could possibly match what they had already witnessed. The scheduled concert proceeded beautifully. The orchestra performed with exceptional precision, the guest soloists delivered stunning interpretations, and the conductor guided everything with consummate skill. By any objective measure, it was an excellent evening of classical music, but everyone in the hall understood that the true performance had already happened. The unplanned moments before the official program had begun. The confusion, the revelation, the confrontation, and finally the resolution through compassion rather than judgment. When intermission arrived, the lobby buzzed with animated conversations. People were not discussing the technical brilliance of the first half program. They were discussing André Rieu, the young crew member, the father who had given up performing, the choice to extend grace instead of demanding accountability. A group of musicians who had been in the audience clustered together, their conversation intense and heartfelt. Did you see how he handled that? One violinist said to her companions. He could have destroyed that young man, could have demanded he be fired, could have made him an example. Instead, he turned it into a teaching moment. Another musician nodded. That is what separates the truly great artists from merely talented ones. Technical skill you can teach. That kind of wisdom, that kind of compassion, that comes from something deeper. Near the refreshment stand, the young crew member stood with the event director, writing down his father's contact information. His eyes were still red from crying, but his expression had changed. The shame and fear that had driven him to his confession had been replaced with something else. Hope, perhaps, or relief, or gratitude for a kindness he had not earned, but had been given anyway. The director spoke to him in low tones. You understand that there will still be consequences for what you did. I cannot simply ignore the fact that you deliberately altered our scheduling system. The young man nodded. I understand, and I accept whatever consequences you decide are appropriate. I was wrong. I let my personal feelings interfere with my professional responsibilities. The director's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your honesty. And I appreciate that Maestro Rieu has chosen to handle this with such grace, but we will need to discuss this further tomorrow, when we have all had time to process what happened here tonight. Thank you, the young man said quietly, for not calling security, for letting me explain. The director allowed herself a small smile. To be honest, after watching Maestro Rieu turn away security earlier, I thought it might be wise to hear people out before rushing to judgment. They both laughed softly at that, the tension between them easing slightly. Backstage, André sat in a quiet corner with a cup of tea, accepting well wishes from various staff members who approached him. Each one apologized for the earlier confusion. Each one praised his handling of the situation. He responded to all of them with the same warm gratitude, making each person feel seen and valued. The conductor of the evening's program sat down beside him during a brief lull in the visitors. "That was extraordinary," he said simply. "What you did out there for that young man, for his father." André shrugged slightly. "I did what felt right. And to be honest, his story touched something in me. We forget sometimes, those of us who have been successful, how precarious this profession is. How many talented people never get their chance. How much luck and timing matter alongside skill." The conductor nodded thoughtfully. "I have been thinking about that. About all the musicians I know who gave up their dreams, who teach now or work regular jobs or play in their homes for no one but themselves. We tend to dismiss them as not quite good enough, but maybe that is the wrong way to think about it." André looked at him with interest. "What do you mean?" "Maybe," the conductor said slowly, working out the thought as he spoke, "maybe the measure of a musician is not whether they achieve fame or professional success. Maybe it is whether they maintain their love for music even when it does not love them back in the ways they hoped. Maybe someone like Villim, who practiced for hours every day for years even without recognition, is just as much a true musician as any of us." André smiled. "I would very much like to share that thought with Villim when I meet him. I think he might need to hear it." "You are really going to follow through with that, meeting him?" "Of course," André said, sounding surprised the question even needed to be asked. "I do not make promises I do not intend to keep. Besides, I am genuinely curious about him, about his story, about what kept him playing even after the disappointments." The second half of the concert began, and André joined the audience to watch from a seat that had been quickly arranged for him in one of the side boxes. From there, he could see both the stage and the audience's reaction. He watched the orchestra with genuine appreciation, noting small moments of excellence that others might miss. A particularly beautiful phrase from the oboe, a cellist's perfect vibrato, the way the brass section breathed together before a crucial entrance. But he also watched the audience, saw how they responded to the music, noticed the young couple holding hands, both with eyes closed, simply feeling the sound, saw the elderly man conducting along quietly with the music, his fingers moving in practiced patterns, observed the teenager who had been skeptical at the start, now leaning forward with complete engagement. "This," he thought, "is why we do this. Not for the recognition, not for the applause, though that is nice. We do it for these moments of connection, when music reaches across all the boundaries we build between ourselves and reminds us of our shared humanity." Near the end of the concert, the conductor made an unexpected announcement. "Before our final piece tonight," he said, addressing the audience, "I would like to invite Maestro André Rieu to join us for one selection, if he is willing." The audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. André, from his seat in the box, smiled and stood, acknowledging the invitation with a gracious nod. He made his way backstage, collected his violin, and joined the orchestra on stage. There was no time for rehearsal, no detailed discussion of interpretation. But when you have been a musician as long as André had, sometimes you do not need those things. You simply trust in the collective language of music. The piece they performed together was simple, beautiful, something most of the orchestra knew well enough to adapt to a guest performer, and André's playing wove through it like a golden thread, adding color and warmth without overwhelming the ensemble. When the final note faded, the applause was immediate and sustained. The orchestra members smiled at André, several nodding their appreciation for how seamlessly he had integrated into their sound. The conductor shook his hand warmly, and then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, turned and applauded André himself, joined quickly by the entire orchestra. As the audience stood for their ovation, André noticed the young crew member watching from the wings. He caught the young man's eye and nodded once, a small acknowledgement. The young man nodded back, his expression showing deep gratitude. After the concert ended and the audience had finally departed, André gathered his things and prepared to leave. The event director approached him one final time. "Maestro, I hope you will consider returning to perform for us again, under better circumstances next time." André laughed. "Oh, I do not know. These circumstances turned out rather well, do you not think?" She smiled. "They did, thanks entirely to your graciousness. But I promise you, next time your name will be so firmly secured in our system that an act of divine intervention could not remove it." I will hold you to that, André said warmly. And please do make sure that young man's punishment is not too severe. He made a mistake, yes, but he also showed courage in admitting to it. That should count for something. It will, the director assured him. In fact, I have been thinking, we have a mentorship program for young staff members. Perhaps he might benefit from some guidance about how to handle personal feelings in professional settings. An excellent idea, André agreed. And if you would permit me to make a suggestion, perhaps as part of that mentorship, he could assist with coordinating my visit with his father. It would give him a chance to see how something positive can come from acknowledging and working through mistakes. The director nodded slowly. I think that would be very appropriate, and very kind of you to suggest. 3 weeks later, André did indeed meet Villim Janssen. It was not a public event, just a quiet afternoon in Villim's modest home. The father and son greeted André with obvious nervousness, but he put them at ease quickly with his genuine warmth and interest. Villim had indeed kept his violin. It was not an expensive instrument, but it had been well cared for, maintained with the devotion of someone who loved it, despite having given up performing. André asked Villim to play something for him. Anything, whatever felt right. Villim hesitated. I have not performed for anyone in 20 years. Then you are long overdue, André said gently. Villim tuned the instrument, his hands remembering movements they had performed thousands of times before. Then he lifted the violin to his shoulder, closed his eyes and played. It was not a flawless performance. There were moments of hesitation, notes that did not speak quite as clearly as they once might have, technical passages that were rougher than they would have been in his prime. But it was music, real, genuine, heartfelt music, the kind that comes from someone who plays not for others, but for the sheer necessity of expressing something that cannot be contained. When Villim finished, he lowered the violin quickly, embarrassed. I know it is not very good anymore. André shook his head firmly. It is better than good. It is honest. It is filled with feeling. Those are the things that matter most. He spent the next 2 hours with Villim and his son. They talked about music, about dreams deferred, about finding meaning even when paths do not turn out as hoped. André shared his own stories of rejection and disappointment from his early career, of auditions that went poorly, of opportunities that vanished, of moments when he too had wondered if he should give up. The difference, André acknowledged, is that circumstances aligned for me in ways they did not for you. That does not make me more deserving. It makes me lucky, and aware that I have a responsibility to honor that luck by remembering people like you, by acknowledging that talent exists everywhere, not just on famous stages. Before he left, André made Villim a promise. I would like to arrange a small gathering, just a few people, musicians, music lovers, anyone who understands that music is valuable regardless of where it is performed, and I would like you to play for them, not as an audition, not as a judgment, just as a sharing of something beautiful. Villim's eyes filled with tears. Why would you do that for me? André smiled. Because your son was right. Success should not be the only measure of worth. Dedication matters. Love matters. Persistence matters. You embody all of those things, and that deserves to be witnessed and celebrated. The gathering happened 2 months later. It was small, intimate, held in a beautiful room with excellent acoustics. Villim played 3 pieces, and while his technique might not have matched professional standards, the emotion and sincerity of his performance moved everyone present. Afterward, several people approached Villim to thank him, to tell him how his story had touched them, to share their own experiences of dreams that had not worked out as planned, but that still held meaning. And the young crew member, Villim's son, watched it all with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of pain this time, but of gratitude. Gratitude that his anger had been met with compassion, that his father's story had been honored rather than dismissed, that a mistake born from hurt had been transformed into something healing. The night André Rieu was told to leave a stage where he absolutely belonged became a story that spread through the classical music community, but it was not told as a story of error corrected. It was told as a story of grace extended, of one musician seeing another human's pain and choosing to respond with understanding rather than retribution. And for Villim Janssen, the musician who had given up performing 2 decades earlier, it became the story of how he found his way back to music. Not through fame or success, but through being seen, being heard, being reminded that his dedication had value, regardless of whether the world had recognized it before. Some stories do not have tidy endings, they have openings instead, doorways into new possibilities that could not have been imagined before. This was one of those stories. It began with a deletion, a deliberate act of sabotage born from pain, and it ended with restoration, not just of a name on a schedule, but of dignity, of purpose, of the understanding that every person who loves music deeply deserves to have that love honored. André Rieu taught many lessons that night about artistry and professionalism and maintaining grace under pressure. But perhaps the most important lesson was the simplest one, that sometimes the greatest performance has nothing to do with the music you play. It is about the humanity you show when the script goes wrong, and you must choose who you want to be in the unplanned moments. He chose to be kind. He chose to be understanding. He chose to lift up rather than tear down. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that this is what true mastery looks like. Not just technical brilliance, but the wisdom to know that every person carries struggles we cannot see, and the compassion to respond to those struggles with grace. The music was beautiful that night, but the humanity was even more beautiful, and that is why everyone who was there will never forget it.